Great. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 9th Constitution Day lecture organized by DAKSH. I will take a minute to explain the thought process we had when we started this lecture series on 26 November, and then introduce our speaker today. So, while most of you may be aware that DAKSH has been working in the area of constitution, accountability, and the rule of law across all institutions of state, one of the thoughts that we had was, while it is all good to work on a daily basis on some of the issues that affect our institutions and citizens, we also felt that there's a need to spend time reflecting on what the nation has achieved so far and the way forward on some of the issues that as a vibrant and inevitably face. So the thought process behind having a lecture series was to get speakers, people who are at the forefront of dealing with some of the issues that our country faces, ask them to spend time reflecting on the nature of the issue, the journey that we have had, and the way forward on some of the on the issues that they talk about in the broad context of the Constitution. It was our way of not only celebrating what is an important milestone in the history of India, despite our tremendously long history. The adoption of the Constitution is a milestone, and apart from celebrating, also looking forward to carry the same message. So that was the purpose behind having instituting this lecture. Thankfully, we have been continuing it, for so many years, and today is the ninth edition. So today we have our speaker is Dr. Bibek Debroy. I will take a few minutes to introduce Bibek. I know it is very common to say, "Oh, he needs no introduction," and then go on to introduce, talk about him for a few minutes. But Bibek is I'm taking a few minutes because Bibek is a multifaceted personality, something we don't realize because we tend to pigeonhole him as an economist at times, and some lawyers think he's a lawyer because he's written so often on legal issues, particularly in the making of the laws, which very few lawyers tend to focus on, and the multitude of laws we sometimes have. Bibek is one of the few scholars who's written insightfully on the need to constantly review our legal system in terms of old laws and new laws. Bibek, as all of us know, is currently the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. He has held many academic and non-academic positions over his career, each of them in a very distinguished institution. He's received many awards during a long and distinguished career. I'll only mention the Padma Shri, which he was awarded in 2015. He is a very prolific scholar. He's written more than 100 books. I won't mention his books on economics and development and at the intersection of law, economics, and data. But I will mention that he's also a very prolific translator, and very few of us know his extremely well-received translations on the Mahabharata, Ramayana, among other things. So with that introduction, I will request Bibek to deliver the 9th Constitution Day lecture. He's going to be speaking about federalism. I will stop there, and over to you, Bibek.
Thank you, DAKSH, and thank you, Harish, for inviting me and for this very, very kind introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, whoever is watching or listening in. I'm conscious of the very great honor that DAKSH has shown me in asking me to deliver this Constitution Day lecture. As was said, I've been asked to speak on Indian federalism and the journey so far. I'm not a trained lawyer. I do not specialize in constitution law. And therefore, I'm not really qualified to deliver this particular Constitution Day lecture, especially when I look at the names of the luminaries who have delivered the 8 Constitutional Day lectures before me. I think the main reason why I've invited, apart from Harish's kindness and Daksha's kindness, is of my interest in law and law reforms. And it all started a long, long time ago, in 1993 to be precise, soon after the reforms of 1991, when I was asked by the then Finance Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, to head a project on legal reforms. In the course of that, I developed an interest in the law, and for those who do not know, as long as that project went on, I was actually visiting faculty at the National Law School in Bangalore. At that time, in 1993, when we were trying to do research and getting research done on law and the legal system, I wish organizations like DAKSH and organizations like Vidhi had existed. It would have made the task of law reform and advocacy on legal reform so much easier. So therefore, let me stress, not simply because I've been invited by DAKSH, but let me stress that DAKSH does wonderful, wonderful work in the area. I mentioned the reforms of 1991. And quite often people will say reforms are getting done, reforms are not getting done, this is reform, that is not reform. When they make remarks like this, all of them, they have their own individual prisms with which they define the expression reforms. So in my view, these are reforms. If these reforms are getting done, then I'd say, big bang. If the reforms that are dear to my heart are not getting done, I will say the government is not reform. So the definition of reforms therefore tends to be somewhat subjective. But whatever be the definition of reforms, any economist will say reforms are characterized by competition, choice, and efficiency. Reforms are characterized by dependence on markets, or more dependence on markets and less dependence on the state or the government. This is generally how all reforms have been defined since the year 1991. And economists in textbooks and otherwise are fond of talking about a market. But what is a market? A market is not a physical vegetable mandi where I go to buy and sell vegetables. That's not a market. A market for economists is a conceptual structure. Any market has a certain backdrop. And the backdrop to that market, the backdrop to the definition of the market, is determined by the legal infrastructure. So if the legal infrastructure fails to do what it is supposed to do, if it fails to deliver on efficient dispute resolution, if the law fails to be a credible deterrent, if the law prevents the market from functioning, then markets will not occur. Markets will not develop. In other words, economic reform cannot be delinked from the legal system. And I'm always constantly appalled by the fact that economists who talk about reforms know so little about the law. And in passing, let me mention the law and economics movement, which is an interface between lawyers and economists. And I'm sorry to say that the law and economics movement has never really developed in India. Legal reforms, as Harish said, are about statutes. They're about administrative law. They're also about speed of dispute resolution. But in addition, any reform of a statute, any reform of an administrative law also has inbuilt in it a position, an ideological position, if one is going to use that word, about the role of the state, the role of the government. For instance, in the heyday of government or state intervention in India between the second half of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, many statutes, some of which continue to exist on statute books, were enacted. So let us recognize law reform also involves a certain ideology about what the state should do, what the state should not do, what is the responsibility of the state, what is not the responsibility of the state, what are the priorities for the state. So it is not neutral in the sense that there are value judgments. I've spoken about the law. Which is the most important statute? It's an obvious enough question, particularly today. The most important statute, so to speak, the enabling framework for all of our laws since the year 1950 has been the Constitution. We, the people, gave ourselves this Constitution in the year 1950. And the entire socio-economic framework, the entire legal framework, the entire ideology or non-ideology of state intervention in the economy, the entire edifice for reforms has to be based on the Constitution. The Constitution we have today, and I'm stating the obvious, the Constitution we have today is not the Constitution we had in 1950. It's an obvious point, but I think it needs to be stressed. The Constitution we have today has been through several amendments. all of the amendments have not been important ones. Out of all the amendments, I think about 20%, subjectively speaking, in terms of my identification, about 20 amendments have been major ones. But that's my subjective way of looking at things. What are the important amendments from my point of view? Major ones, they are Schedule 9. They are chipping away at property rights. They are the First Amendment and its relationship to freedom of speech. They are equality before the law. They are reorganization of the states along linguistic lines. They are the preamble or the change in the preamble, and I will come back to this. They are the anti-defection law. They are the recognition of the local bodies, the 73rd and the 74th constitutional amendments. They are the provisions on sharing of taxes between the union and state governments. They are the right to education. There are restrictions on the number of ministries, and they are GST. So given the topic that has been given to me today, all of these are relevant amendments, major ones. But obviously, the most important amendments to the Constitution, given the topic, are the 73rd and the 74th and perhaps the 101st. I said I'm not a lawyer. Not being a lawyer, and I'm talking about the Constitution now, I do not understand. I do not understand the decision in the Keshavananda Bharati case. I do not understand what it is to mean that the basic structure of the Constitution cannot be changed. To me, a change in the preamble, and I will come back to this point in a minute, to me a change in the preamble to make the preamble socialist is a change in the basic structure. I do not understand the judgments in Indira Gandhi versus Rajnarayan and in Minerva Mills versus Union of India, which to me suggest that the courts will decide post 1973, the courts will decide on a case-to-case basis what is a change in the basic structure. The Constitution is meant to be dynamic. The Constitution is meant to reflect the will of the people in an indirect system like ours through Parliament. So how can the basic structure of the Constitution not be changed? As a citizen, I do not understand. As a citizen, I do not understand, and I'm talking about the Keshavananda Bharati case, where the 13-judge constitutional bench decided in a ratio of 7:6. In other words, if one honorable judge of the Supreme Court has decided otherwise, we would have had a situation where the basic structure of the Constitution could be changed. To protect myself against the Contempt of Courts Act, let me clarify and say, I am not a lawyer. I am not a constitutional lawyer. I am asking this question as a citizen. The National Law University, Delhi, has a center on the death penalty. And in 2017, the Center on the Death Penalty in the National Law University, Delhi, it published a study. And this was called Matters of Judgment. And I found this study very worrying. What did this study do? it had some hypothetical cases, hypothetical scenarios where the offender might or might not warrant the death penalty. Hypothetical cases, and these cases were shown to 60 former Supreme Court judges, some of whom had awarded the death penalty, to ascertain if those judges felt this was one of those rarest of rarest cases where the death penalty should be awarded. Was there unanimity? There wasn't. Exactly similarly, I do not think there can ever be unanimity about what is the basic structure of the Constitution and what is not. And that is the reason I want to stress this point, that a Constitution needs to be dynamic. When the insertion of the word socialist was contemplated in the Constituent Assembly debates, Dr. Ambedkar opposed the insertion of the word socialist on 15th of November 1948. On 15th of November 1948, Dr. Ambedkar, opposing the insertion of the word socialist in the Constitution, said, whether the future India will believe in socialism or will not believe in socialism is to be determined in the future by the citizens of India. Why should we in 1948 decide that India will be a socialist society? The preamble may not be important. Well, it is. But as a result of this change, the Representation of the People Act of 1951 was changed, so that no political party in India can be registered until it professes to be a socialist party. I do not understand what the word socialism means, because it can mean all kinds of different things. So I do not understand what it means when a political party, before to get registered as a political party, says it is a socialist political party. The reason I am mentioning this, and I will come back to this refrain later on, is that there are several sections on the Constitution that I think need to be amended. Article 12 would be one example of that. Article 39C would be one example of that. As everyone listening in knows, there was a National Commission to review the Constitution in the year 2000. In my view, it only tinkered. The more fundamental issue about the Constitution and what the Constitution should be is an issue it did not get into. I've spent enough time on the Constitution, so let me now turn to the question of federation. India is not quite a federation in a legal sense, in the sense that states have not come together to form this union. India is a union of states. We say federation, but it's not quite a legal federation. It is up to the union government under Articles 2 and 3 to create new states or to alter the boundaries. And over a period of time, since the States Reorganization Commission in 1953, which was a systematic attempt to draw up the boundaries of the new states, since then there have been several new states. And these states now amount to, apart from the union territories, there are 29 states. If one is looking at it from the point of view of a federation, not in the legal sense, in the sense we are talking about it, It's about the provision of public goods. We can debate about what are public goods, but somewhere down the line we will agree that these are public goods, the market will not deliver them, and therefore the state has to deliver them. So the question that then arises is, to deliver these public goods, A, how do I get the revenue? Through taxes or other than taxes? That's question number one. Question number two is, what do I spend that revenue on? Because there are various demands on government's fiscal capacity and administrative capacity. I cannot cater to everything. So in terms of prioritization, what is it that state, meaning the government, should focus on? And three, most important, at what level of government does this expenditure and even the collection of revenue take place? When I'm talking about a federation, that is really the critical question. Which layer of government should be spending this public expenditure that we've agreed on? At what level of government will the revenue be collected, and how will it be devolved? Usually downwards. That's really the topic of what we are talking about today. If that is the logic, let's accept that public goods and services can be optimally delivered at a certain level. Above that level and below that level, this economies of scale and scope setting. In other words, having defined those public goods and services, they are optimally delivered at a certain level of government and not at a different level of government. This is really the question. Since states are the administrative boundaries, I am therefore flagging the question of using that optimal delivery of public goods prism to define the creation of states. The States Reorganization Commission of 1953 mentioned this as one of the criteria. It talked about, within quotes, successful working of the national plan. Successful working of the national plan, the way I have stated it, is nothing but the delivery of public goods and services. Having talked about the successful working of the national plan, the first States Reorganization Commission, and remember this was 1953, essentially identified states because of historical reasons, because of linguistic reasons. My submission is, and this is how I will end eventually, my submission is, this is not a rational way to think of a federation. This is not a rational way to think of optimal delivery of public goods and services. This is not a rational way to think of states. This is not a rational way to think of the federation that India should be. Consider this. UP. What is UP's population? It's 200 million. How can you optimally deliver public goods and services with a population of 200 million? It's suboptimal. What is Sikkim's population? About 610,000. That's also suboptimal. How can you optimally deliver public goods and services with a population of 610,000? If you don't like population, perhaps we can use geographical area. So I have Rajasthan with a geographical expanse of 342,000 square kilometers. 342,000 square kilometers. And I have Goa with an area of 3,700 square kilometers. Neither of this can be optimal. If one looked at it rationally, economic reasons, not linguistic reasons, not historical reasons, not issues connected with the integration of princely states, if one had a cutoff, whatever be the threshold cutoff in terms of population and or geographical area, perhaps population of 25 million, and a similar kind of indicator for geographical area, I think rationally we would arrive at a figure of something like 50 to 60 states for India. I don't know what the exact figure is. Curiously, if you look at all the demands and aggregate them, you'll also get at arrive at a figure of about 50 to 60 states. On public goods and services, a point in passing. As a country, as a society, I am committed to delivering public goods and services to every citizen of the country wherever he or she happens to reside. Let's say we have about 600,000 villages now, roughly, that's the number. About 90,000 of them have population sizes less than 200. They are sparse villages. Over a period of time, of course, villages get integrated. The villages with low populations, they tend to disappear. They are reclassified. They get integrated into larger villages. They lose populations. But until that happens in a process of development, under those small villages disappear, I have to deliver goods and services. In the Nicobar Islands, in Nankauri Taluk, there is a village. In Nankauri Taluk in Nicobar district, there is a village. I hope I'm pronouncing the name of the village right. It seems to have two names, Inrok or Chinluk. What's remarkable about this village in Nankauri Taluk of Nicobar district? It has only one single resident. So until that single resident in that village moves away elsewhere, there is an obligation to provide public goods and services also to that individual. Federalism is more often than not defined in terms of finance. The devolution of federal finance. And in terms of that, partly we have the Constitution, but I think it's important to mention that much of what is in the Constitution is based on the Government of India Act of 1935. So when we are questioning many of the historical things that we have inherited as a legacy, I think it's legitimate to also question the Government of India Act of 1935 or the imprint, the Government of India Act of 1935, which was a product of history left on the Constitution of India. And at the moment, I'm talking about the federal part of it. And the Government of India Act of 1935 bore the imprint of the Government of India Act of 1990. And what we have in the Constitution on union-state fiscal relationships is the product of the Government of India Act of 1935 and some committee reports from the late 1930s and the late 1940s. The Indian Financial Inquiry Report of 1936, the Krishnamachari Committee Report of 1948, the Sarkar Committee of 1948. So, on this bit, let me just leave you with this thought. To optimally deliver public goods and services, we need to decide, getting away from the history, getting away from the legacy, getting away from linguistics. How do we decide norms for population and for geographical area to have a rationally determined number of states? Perhaps by setting up a second states reorganization commission. By the way, the Central Groundwater Board has a listing of 34 river basins, and for many purposes of planning, the river basins are a very convenient tool, which again reinforces the point that I made, that we might perhaps rationally end up with 50 states or thereabouts. So when we are talking about union-state relationships, a large part of the time it is about revenue. Although the discourse is more often than not about fiscal devolution from union government to state government. But we should also talk about revenue. We should also talk about non-tax revenue, not only at the level of union government, but also at the level of the states. We should talk about monetizing assets. We should talk about the public sector enterprises, not only at the level of the union government, but also at the level of the states. On tax revenue, there is the direct side and there is the indirect side. On both of these, fundamental tax reform is about the removal of exemptions. But let me leave that aside. On indirect taxes, with all of its warts and blemishes and imperfections, we have a GST. And we have a GST council, which is a unique experiment in terms of a forum that involves the union government and the state government. This is the first time something like this has happened. We still need to question the decision-making process of the GST council, whereby a 14% compensation has been guaranteed to state governments, regardless of what the nominal rate of growth is, with the consequent result that it creates perverse incentives. And in terms of the different rates of GST, there is an attempt by state governments, because they're guaranteed of that revenue compensation of 14%. This is what I meant by perverse incentives. They are motivated to move more and more items to, let's say, the 0% category. A proper GST will involve standardization and harmonization. As consumers, we would want the 28% to come down, but we must also be prepared to have that 0% come up. The GST was supposed to replace all other indirect taxes, and at that time various calculations were done about what is the average revenue neutral rate that would guarantee you the same amount of revenue, you meaning the union government as well as state governments. And those calculations were 17% and upwards. What is the average GST rate today? 11.5%. I'm not going to go off on a tangent and talk about GST. I'm just making the point that in talking about a proper federation, we need about a proper forum for discussing union-state relationships, where we do not have perverse incentives, where for the benefit of the country as a whole, we decide A, what are our priorities so far as government expenditure is concerned, and which layer of government spends it on. To take an example, how much does union government and state government together collect as taxes as a percentage of GDP? Union plus state. It's about 15% of GDP. It used to be a little bit more, at about 16%. Now it's about 15% of GDP. So 15% of GDP is collected by union and state governments as taxes. Look at the demands. 6%, and I'm talking about public expenditure, 6% must be spent on education. 4% must be spent on health, that's 10%. 10% must be spent on infrastructure, 10 plus 10, that's 20%. 3% must be spent on defense, 20 plus 3, 23%. So the demands are already 23%. And the kitty of taxes I have is just 16%. So to repeat, in an indirect democracy like ours, it is the state government and union governments coming together which decide on behalf of the citizens in a proper federation. A, what should the government spend on? B, what layer of government should spend it? Often it has been said that India is excessively centralized. In terms of governance, whatever be the definition of governance, India is excessively centralized. Even before China reformed in 1978-79, China was much more decentralized. So India should be decentralized. Not just fiscally. This isn't just about fiscal devolution. It's about decentralizing all decision making. Yet, well, firstly, look at the mindset. We continuously use the word center. Center-state relationships. Suggesting here there is a center sitting there in the center, everything else is a periphery. The word center is not used in the constitution. India is an union of states. So how come even a government committee called itself the Committee on Center-State Relationships? But returning to the point, whenever we talk about federation and federal relationships, why do we only talk about union government and its relationship with the state governments? Why don't we talk about relationships between the state governments and local bodies? Why don't we talk about the decentralization of decision making and fiscal devolution and the transfer of funds, functions, and functionaries to local bodies as mandated by the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments? Why are we so obsessed with what the 15th Union Finance Commission has recommended, though the recommendations on the report are not yet in the public domain? And why do we spend such little time on the recommendations and the non-implementation of the recommendations of the state finance commissions? Public goods, whatever be your definition of public goods, one will generally find that in that basket of public goods, most public goods and services are actually delivered by local government. Only a few will be delivered by state government, and even fewer will be delivered by union government. In other words, to be specific, what I am now talking about is the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, which as everyone listening here knows, has a union list, has a concurrent list, and has a state list, reflecting, and I repeat, reflecting the Government of India Act of 1935. In the Government of India Act of 1935, and therefore in the Constitution, there was a need to ensure the integration of the provinces. There was need to ensure India's unity. There was need to introduce centralization for that purpose. In the interest of planning, there was a need to have excessive centralization. India is now mature enough. I don't think anyone seriously believes that the unity and integration of India will come into question if you decentralize. So I think in talking about a federation, we are talking about taking a re-look at the 7th schedule. It's not that the 7th schedule has not been changed. Whenever it has been changed, it's been changed upwards, meaning state list, move it to the union list, etc. Concurrent list, move it to the union list, state list, move it to the concurrent list. I am conscious that several people have argued that agriculture should be moved to the union list. I'm conscious that several people have argued that police and law and order should be moved to the concurrent list. So I'm not getting into individual items. All I'm saying is, conceptually, I think we should look at a pruned union list, probably a complete elimination of the concurrent list, perhaps a pruned state list also, and certainly a local body list. In passing, as a matter of debate, not debate here, as a matter of debate and discourse generally, of course, the Finance Commission recommends a certain devolution of the divisible pool of taxes between the union government and the state government. I'm talking about the Union Finance Commission. But in addition, there are central sector schemes in areas that are regarded as important and centrally sponsored schemes. Central sector schemes are schemes where 100% funding comes from the center, the union. Centrally sponsored schemes are where there has to be a matching grant. So let's ask ourselves the following question, and I mean this is a rhetorical question. Since health is on the state list, should union government have funded schemes in health? You might argue health is important, so union government should, regardless of in which list it is. But by the same token, isn't defense important enough? So if health is important and union government is supposed to spend in health, if defense is important, shouldn't state governments also be requested to spend on defense? I said these are rhetorical questions. But from the expenditure angle of the federation issue, I want to mention that we have more than 450 such central sector and, more importantly, central sponsored schemes. They've not been pruned, they've just been renumbered, and we've got umbrella schemes. So someone somewhere between the union government and state governments need to devise and debate what should be the basket of public expenditure. Look at certain contemporary issues. What is the definition of a farmer? We constantly talk about a farmer. What is the definition of a farmer? Well, essentially the definition of a farmer is linked to ownership of agricultural land. But across this union of states, do we have a uniform definition on who can buy agricultural land and later convert it to non-agricultural usage? We don't. Across this union that is India, do we have a unified template about what should be done in the case of a disaster like COVID? Not just a pandemic, other disasters? We don't. Do we have a unified template and what an advisory issued by the Indian Council of Medical Research means for states? Do we have a unified template on what is a lockdown? Who decides a lockdown? Does the state government do it or does the district magistrate do it under section 144? I'm just flagging these. These two are rhetorical questions. So fundamentally what I think, I'm nearing the end, fundamentally what I think is we need a forum. Just as the GST is a preliminary forum, the GST Council is a preliminary forum with the problems that I mentioned, we need a forum to discuss all of these things about optimal level of delivery of public goods and services, including the layer which is the Federation. The GST Council is not empowered to do that. We used to have the NDC, the National Development Council, but that was more of ornamental. We have an interstate council, but it does something completely different. This is not really the Finance Commission's mandate, 15th or 16th or whatever. With this federation angle, I think we need a fresh Constitution Review Commission. Tied to that, we need a fresh Expenditure Reforms Commission. We need a fresh States Reorganization Commission. This is the year 2020. We are approaching 2021. It's been more than 100 years since the Government of India Act 1919, which in turn was partially inherited by the Morley-Minto reforms, more than 100 years. So I think it is time for us to redefine what federalism means in this union of ours, in the Bharat that is in India, maybe 50 to 60 states, maybe a large part of the governance through 740 districts, maybe a completely revamped 7th schedule. In terms of the journey so far, which was the subheading, looked at in terms using the lens that I've used in my talk, the journey so far is a journey that we have just started. We need to clean the slate quite a bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bibek. That was a really, really insightful talk, and I think you sort of, you should not say that you don't understand the Constitution through a lawyer's lens. I think, in fact, while just to just to give you a few minutes to recover from the long talk and get a sip of water while I gather the questions. I think one of the things that we have been debating is also, I think the Constitution may be too important to be left only to lawyers. I think we need to look at practitioners of the Constitution as well in terms of what the Constitution means for each of us in its different aspects, right? And not just Article 32 and the Supreme Court, or Article 226 and the High Court, and questioning of state action, but looking at the Constitution as a document, as a dynamic document that has many other things, which unfortunately or fortunately sometimes don't come into the public eye. So I think thanks very much. I think it is a very, very insightful talk, as expected. There were 2-3 points which I thought I will highlight and then dive into the questions. We have about 10 questions. We'll take only as much as we have time for. Maybe what I'll do, Bibek, is take a couple of questions at a time, and I'll let you sort of respond to them. But I find it particularly interesting that you said that we need to look at federalism from the prism of distribution of public goods and services, and really we need to focus more on local self-government, the local governments, and not just the state government when we're talking about federalism. It's not just union and states, but also the local self-governments, which unfortunately in many states have been suffering from, some of the state governments have been taking back the powers that they have that they had devolved to the local bodies like panchayats and municipal corporations. And I'm sure you are aware that every time an election has to be held for the panchayats or the municipal corporations, always a delay. I can tell you that in Karnataka, for example, we are having a delay, and invariably there's a court battle about when an election need to happen, and this is across the state. So that's an interesting thing that you mentioned in terms of the need to look at local self bodies, given how the experience of local self bodies is happening. The other point which I thought was particularly interesting is the seventh schedule and the need to relook at the seventh schedule. And I think it's time as well, because even if you read the seventh schedule, some of the entries themselves are irrelevant anymore, because they were made the entries were made so many years ago, when some of those topics were relevant for legislation, and things today they're not anymore. So I find it fascinating, and this number of 50 states that you mentioned is also something people have come up with earlier, and although not on the basis of any logic, but more as a number of states that India could potentially have. So let me get to some questions. And so two questions in particular. Two questions in particular, I think we can start with that. One, let me not modify the language and go with the language. So what should be the criteria for determining what issues should be handled by center, state, and local governments? So if we're looking at revamping the seventh schedule, then what measures do you do that? Is there a legitimate way of doing it? That's one question. The second question, I think, is linked. Does this have something to do with the accountability mechanisms you can build with the different levels of government that should go into determining that distribution of powers? And the link, one more question linked to that is: do we need also institutional space for negotiation between different levels of government? And the example of GST compensation, farm bills, states withdrawing cooperation to CBI have all been taken, and says, do all these indicate there's an absence of institutional space for negotiation, which could reduce some of these tensions? So I'll let you maybe respond to those two sets of questions, and then we can take some later.
On the criteria for the seventh schedule, by the way, because I got the chance, let me mention that I think many of the other schedules should also be looked at, including the ninth, including perhaps the fifth or the sixth, although I don't want to set a cat amongst the pigeons. But let me come to the seventh schedule. I think there can be some objective economic criteria on the basis of which you can decide that this particular item is ideally suited for the local body. Obviously, for example, defense cannot be left to the local body. Obviously, international relations cannot be left to the local body. But protecting the environment in terms of, let us say, preserving local ponds, I don't see why that should not be left to the local body. So I think through an iterative process, one can evolve the criteria. It has to be an iterative process. It has to be a process that is debated. But we should also recognize before doing this that we should look at it on grounds of reason and not on grounds of emotion. So far as accountability is concerned, government broadly defined has now become relatively more transparent and accountable because of countervailing pressure exercised by citizens. Maybe a little bit more in urban and semi-urban India, maybe a little bit less in rural India, but whether it is the right to information or other things, citizens have become much more demanding. Think now of which public goods and services you go and demand. As a citizen, when you go and demand a public goods and service, think of the things you demand. Is the local roads. It is the local this, it is the local that. Rare is it that as a citizen you will go and demand that this is what I want to do, what the union government to do with a neighbor. That's okay for television. But otherwise, what you demand in terms of that accountability is at the level of the local body, whether it is the panchayat or the municipality. So the demand side pressure of accountability is already happening on the local government. But the local government has to respond in catering to that greater pressure, demand-driven pressure for more transparent and more efficient public goods and services. The local body requires revenue. For the local body, certainly on the panchayat side, there are limited sources of revenue. There is much more that can be done for a municipality. In other words, the supply side of government has to respond. In other words, there has to be fiscal devolution, not just from union government to state government, but from state governments downwards. I don't really like in those terms what the 14th Finance Commission did. I don't think it is the role of the Union Finance Commission to give funds to local bodies. So I would say the accountability pressures already exist, but the way I would interpret what I've just said is you're not enabling the local body because of the excessively centralized system to respond to that. Institutional mechanism, of course, that was the point that I was making. I think an institutional mechanism should indeed exist. It is absent today, not just union and state government, but also intra-state.
So, Bibek, moving to the next couple of questions, I think there's one interesting question, and I think it follows from what you also talked about, relooking at some of the angles of federalism. The question is, what factors have impeded the formation of a kind of forum that could discuss the various angles of federalism? And how can we sort of form that federalism, that forum which can discuss federalism? Because you mentioned, and I think rightly so, that it may be time to relook at the federation, from different angles. So, what kind of forum is required to look at these issues of federalism? That's one question. Linked to that, is another question. I think is one of the points that has been made is, don't you think linguistic reasons for organizing states can be an important factor in terms of creating an element of faith between citizens and the government, and also expenditure decisions. So, is it possible to sort of completely wish away that element? is a question. That was a question, but I think the example of Andhra and Telangana, sort of, goes contrary to that. Although it is, I mean, historically speaking, it was the death of the Potti Sriramulu, I think, which is actually led to the reorganization of states on linguistic basis. But so again, I'll let you answer those two questions and then take the other questions after.
As long as the planning process was there was no particular need to question the excessive centralization. The excessive centralization was partly inherited from the British, who were interested in maximizing land revenue and other forms of revenue, and it received greater emphasis immediately after 1951 with the planning process and the centralized planning process. So I think the question about decentralization, it may have been debated by people in papers, in academic papers, but it really began to surface in the 1990s as a serious issue. It was partly reflected in the replacement of the Planning Commission by Niti Aayog, where the Planning Commission happened to be primarily a disbursal mechanism for funds of the sector and centrally sponsored schemes, yielding to Niti Aayog. So I would respond at the first question by saying that a system has to evolve, and I think the debate has just started about what we should be doing. The forums to address union state and within the state will evolve, but the debate has just begun to happen. And I'm certain, and I hope, not in that order, the other order, I hope and I'm certain that this kind of debate will be driven by the likes of DAKSH, because it is a debate that needs to happen. All changes typically are the result in an indirect system of the way we citizens want things. I might say that the Consumer Protection Act was introduced by the government. No such thing. It was because of the pressure that it happened. The Environment Protection Act, exactly that. The right to information, exactly that. So the debate discourse, I think, needs to start, driven by people like DAKSH, organizations like DAKSH. I think we need to be clear. When we are talking about states, are we going to be rational about it, or are we going to be driven by emotion? This is like crossing a ditch. You need to jump. You cannot take half a step and presume you're going to be able to cross the ditch. As I said, historically, state formation has been driven by emotional and linguistic grounds. With that delivery of public goods and services, optimal kind of lens, an area has to be reasonably homogeneous. The more heterogeneous it is, the more difficult is it to deliver public goods and services across the unit. It needs homogeneous. But homogeneous has to be primarily defined in terms of the geographical terrain, the physical infrastructure, the level of human development, which may or may not be correlated with something that is linguistic. Linguistic may just happen, but I think the primary determinant should be rational decision making on grounds of homogeneity.
Great. I think there are a couple of more questions, Bibek. The first one in this set is, um, what lessons can we take for federalism, especially in terms of how the pandemic was managed? And I think you did touch upon this briefly in terms of who should lock down, etc. But I think it's a pointed question as to what is the lessons for federalism. Then I think there's a question in a different context, asking in a different way, but I think it's a useful question to answer. Can fiscal devolution and expenditure considerations be the only factor in determining boundaries of states and sub-union governance units? Again, I'll stop with those two questions, and then there's maybe one set of questions more, and we can take it after you answer these two questions.
I'm not ducking the question on COVID, but I'm setting it in a broader context. There is a National Disaster Management Act. Under the National Disaster, and the COVID pandemic is just one example of a disaster. Under the National Disaster Management Act, what powers does the union government have? Maybe we don't want it to have any powers. But if it is going to have some powers, ask ourselves this question. I'm not asking Harish this question. Harish knows. Under what provision of the Constitution in the 7th schedule was the National Disaster Management Act passed? And if you look up the answer, you will be horrified that that is the entry that one had to use to enact something like the National Disaster Management Act. All right. Now the states, the districts are supposed to have their disaster management plans. How many states have formulated district level disaster management plans? You will be shocked at what small number of states have formulated district level disaster management plans. I said earlier that government reacts in an indirect democracy indirectly to the citizen pressure that is being created. As citizens, we constantly ask union government to do something about COVID. It has no powers. Except at the border, it has no powers. How many times, not listeners to this, how many times are we aware who has what powers? How many times do we ask, has a state government formulated district level disaster management plans? How many times is our mindset driven by this excessive centralization? So we expect the union government to do everything. How many times do we consciously push the federation idea? So that would be my response to the first one. The second question about fiscal and revenue, fiscal and expenditure. Well, what else? I mean, to me, those two would be the most important determinants, because what am I trying to do? I'm trying to define the optimal level at which I deliver public goods and services, which means I need the revenue. How do I generate it? And I need to devise the expenditure. These to me would be the two main planks. Maybe there's a third, but I can't think of a third that is important enough right now. But potentially, perhaps there is.
Yeah. So I know, Bibek, that we have constraints on time because it's 6:15, and I know that you have to go at 6:30. But this is the last set of questions. It's a question on federalism and being part of the basic structure, something you touched upon initially, the basic structure concept. It says, isn't federalism or union structure part of the basic conception of the Constitution? And also linked to federalism, Article 370 is a component of federalism. Therefore, does the abrogation of Jammu and Kashmir affect the legitimacy of federalism? Is a question being asked. I think there are multiple facets, and I know some of these questions are in court as well. So I'll let you answer, whatever you choose to on that question.
This is a union government. It's a union of, this is a union polity. It's a union of states, in that sense, union. So there should be complete uniformity across the country, not just one country, one tax. Whenever we mark out a certain area as an enclave, we prevent it from being mainstreamed. So there are two ways to look at it. If I do not allow one particular region of the country to become mainstream, it will always remain an enclave and will never benefit from development. Remember, I mentioned the 5th and the 6th schedule. Article 370 has other such articles also. 371. I think it a little bit strange that I, as an Indian, born in the state of Meghalaya, which was then part of undivided Assam, do not possess the right to own property in general in the state of Meghalaya. Oh, most people don't know about it because most people are unaware about the Northeast. So we will mention Article 370. I'm just pointing out to you that there are other articles also. I find it a little bit strange that my ancestors, having lost their property in Bangladesh, migrated to Meghalaya, which was part of undivided Assam then. And one of the first things you do when you migrate is you buy property. So they bought property. And I find it a little bit strange that overnight their property became illegal because it could not be owned by anyone other than the caste. I'm not getting emotional about it. I'm just making the point that if it is a unified country with unified norms of governance, anything that differentiates needs to be rethought. As a citizen, I must have not only the same kind of public goods and services, irrespective of whether I reside, I should feel free, I should be free to seek employment anywhere. I should be free to own property anywhere. That is what a true federation really is. On the basic structure, I hope I've understood the question. I do want the Constitution to be revamped. Does it require an amendment? Of course it does. It requires a systematic amendment in general. But with that federation kind of idea also it requires amendment. Will courts strike down such amendments? Well, I ventured to voice my skepticism about the basic structure doctrine. But I do think the Constitution needs to be amended.
Okay, so I think that's all we have time for today. I think Bibek, we are at 6:20, and I know that you did say that you have to leave at 6:30. I'll let my colleague Susan Nayak from DAKSH, say a few words and conclude the session.
Thank you, Harish. That was certainly a very thought-provoking session, I think, for all of us who've been here today. I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Debroy again for taking time out of his busy schedule to join us today. And sir, you've certainly left us with a lot of food for thought and also made us rethink and sort of question certain fundamental concepts that all of us have had regarding federalism. So thank you so much, sir, for being here today. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Krishna and the team that has helped us coordinate this event today. Thank you so much. Thanks all again for all our viewers who've joined us and for all the questions that y'all have had during the session. And thank you so much, and hope to see you all in our future events as well. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Harish. Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.